I will soon be taking emergency action, which is unprecedented, to provide financial relief.
We will close our border to any non-residents and citizens attempting to travel here.
We are not telling people to stay indoors.
Looking back on it, can we see that one worked better than the other?
Well, I do think we can conclude now. Of course, we all had to make sure that health was the number one priority. But there were certainly also different countries, including New Zealand and Sweden, that also took different approaches and therefore ended up having also different outcomes. And it has generally been the case today, now that we know that the pandemic, quote unquote, only lasted for a somewhat limited time, that it did turn out to be a better situation to have allowed more flexibility and not be so rigid in terms of what the health restrictions were.
Sweden is one that took that less restrictive approach, avoiding lockdown measures and letting people decide for themselves, an approach that was ridiculed around the world.
As a Swede, I felt quite attacked and harassed during the pandemic, and both foreign friends and media constantly got in touch asking me, are you all crazy over there in Sweden? And we got it from all sides of the political spectrum as well. People saying that Sweden is a cautionary tale. I read that in the New York Times. And President Donald Trump at the time said that, look, Sweden is suffering tremendously. Hundreds of thousands of Americans would die if we do what the Swedes do. So we were basically not very popular at that time, and it felt like we had to defend ourselves. I think many people had a vested interest in explaining the Swedish model a failure before we saw the results.
And the results, as it turned out, were better than expected. Johan Norberg is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. His report on Sweden's pandemic response found that where models forecast a death toll of more than 80,000 by July 2020, Sweden had suffered fewer than 6,000 by that point.
The other aspect is what the Swedish Public Health Agency said. Yes, we might have more cases and deaths early on in Sweden, but this will even out in the long run because no country can completely shut itself off unless they're a tiny island far away from everything. And this is exactly what happened. If you look at total cumulative excess deaths during the whole pandemic period, Sweden came out with one of the lowest excess death rates all over Europe, and less than half of the excess death rate of Britain and the United States. So I think in the end, when we look at the numbers, when we look at the data, I think even some of the opponents of the Swedish model would say that, yeah, we didn't risk people's lives. In fact, it worked out better than in most other rich countries.
Half a world away, New Zealand took yet a third approach. It locked down its borders and implemented strict lockdown measures to avoid community transmission, suffering just 25 deaths from COVID in 2020. But it meant the country was effectively shut off from the rest of the world. Sharon Zollner is the chief economist for New Zealand at ANZ Bank.
It was chaos when COVID first hit, of course, like it was everywhere. Massive uncertainty about what was going to happen. We saw a crash in business confidence. We saw monetary policy ease dramatically. And of course, we had the wage subsidies rolled out very quickly. Of course, inevitably, it was a bit slapdash. But I think probably the single biggest forecasting mistake we all made, the government, the Reserve Bank, private sector, was underestimating just how effective those wage subsidies were going to be. Essentially, we were thinking of COVID as primarily a big negative shock to demand, that it was going to destroy confidence, that we were at risk of a depression. And of course, the GDP numbers were all over the place. You hit pause on an economy and you get crazy things like GDP falling 20% in a quarter. But what we learned ultimately was that those numbers didn't mean anything. All our models saying if GDP does this, then house prices will do that, or GDP does that, employment, this will happen to employment, they all broke immediately, of course, because this wasn't a normal slowdown in GDP. It was an artificial stop, and then a restart, and then a stop, and then a restart. The data, of course, was pandemonium, and it's easy with hindsight to spot the mistakes that were made. But essentially, it boils down to diagnosing COVID as primarily a demand shock. It was not. It was primarily a supply shock once you take into account the wage subsidy. So essentially, people were sitting at home. They figured out that their jobs were safe. They worked out that they were very bored, and that interest rates were the lowest we've ever seen. The housing market started to take off, and everyone went internet shopping. And we saw, as well as just a surge in demand, we saw a big substitution from services to goods. So you couldn't go on holiday to Fiji, so you got a spa instead.
New Zealand spent close to $20 billion between 2020 and 2021 in a wage subsidy program that supported 47% of its jobs.
The first lockdowns were incredibly expensive, of course, for fiscal policy, but they were hugely successful. They bought us a year of normality that other economies didn't have. But I would say there was just a good old-fashioned policy mistake from fiscal policy and monetary policy. If you look at fiscal policy, other countries also went all out with the wage subsidies and a big surge in spending, but then they wound it back very quickly. We didn't. We didn't have to, because our government debt was very low to start with in an international comparison. We also had a left-leaning government. They had pre-funded using that large-scale asset program, so they had money sitting there saying, what shall I do with this? And they had a very, very ambitious reform program in a whole lot of areas, nothing to do with COVID. So the fiscal policy remained extremely expansionary for years. So at the same time that the private sector demand was very, very strong because of the super low interest rates. And so we had pro-cyclical fiscal policy. We had monetary and fiscal policy ultimately working against each other. Once, monetary policy is a lot quicker to turn. And so the Reserve Bank's like, oops, okay, inflation's an awful lot higher than we thought. The economy is actually a lot more overheated than we thought. We need to change direction. Fiscal policy is a much, much slower ship to turn, even if all your weight's on the wheel, and it wasn't. So essentially for quite a long period you had monetary and fiscal policy working against each other. Of course, we've had a doozy of a recession. We've had a very large recession last year. So fiscal policy has also started to turn, but we're still forecasting deficits on all the metrics for years to come. So essentially the main difference between the economy before COVID and now is that our government debt has broadly doubled. So it still looks quite reasonable in an international comparison, but our entire country is built on a fault line. There's nowhere in New Zealand that is really safe from that risk. And then we've got, more extreme weather happening as well. And we've got an infrastructure deficit. We've got an ageing population, like everywhere. So we've got some significant medium-term fiscal challenges.
COVID eventually did break through New Zealand's borders in early 2022, and the death toll spiked, just as other countries like Sweden were emerging from the worst of it.
Sweden is a small and very trade-dependent country, so when the rest of the world suffers and locks down, the Swedish economy suffers too. But the decline in Sweden was much more shallow than in other places, and the recovery was much quicker. Interestingly, when we looked at the end of 2021, where economies were compared to the forecasts before the pandemic, then we could see that by the end of 2021, the world economy was 3% smaller than forecasts had expected. The euro economy was a bit more than 2% smaller. The US economy was 1.2% smaller. The Swedish economy was actually 0.4% bigger than the forecasts from the OECD and the IMF expected before the pandemic. So it tells you that by staying open, by not shutting down society, we save the economy.
In the end, it may be hard to be sure which of the range of approaches worked better than others. We'd all rather forget about the pain and uncertainty of 5 years ago, which may make it hard to anticipate the next one and know which way to go.
During the pandemic era, we had more attention paid to Sweden than ever before, I think. And I was constantly asked about what was going on in Sweden. But afterwards, not a sound. Very few got in touch to see what actually happened. And you're actually one of the few media companies who get in touch to think about, okay, we all thought that Swedes were crazy and that everything was going to the dogs. Now, 5 years later, what really happened? You would think that that would be of interest to people, but it seems like we just want to forget and move on.
More bad, spooky stuff is possible today than ever before, but so is the tooling. I am surrounded by a tribe of people, public servants, some of whom are in government, some of whom are out of government, who are working on building those solutions today for defense, for health security, for intelligence, and I am ever full of hope